Olga Bataman, RT, and I would like to follow up on what you just mentioned. Thank you so much for highlighting that so many countries of Africa and of the global south are severely underrepresented in key UN structures. So first of all, is your organization going to address this issue in the near future or in the long run? And for example, just recently, Nigeria protested that there was a UN event arranged by the United States where Nigeria was discussed, but Nigerian delegation was not even invited, and Nicki Minaj was speaking at that event. So how can it happen that issues concerning individual states can be discussed at UN forums or events without their participation? Thank you so much for your reply.
Well, there might have been that event. It's the first time I hear about it. We had a very important summit in Nigeria on counterterrorism, so it's not our intention at all to make Nigeria not present in all our discussions. And for us, I believe, if you look at what is today the senior management of the UN, you will see that that senior management is quite balanced globally. And at the same time, if you look at the programs of action of most of the UN entities, they are essentially focused on the interests of developing countries. But there is one problem that I cannot solve, because when people look at the UN, many people do not see the humanitarian work that we do, sometimes in extremely difficult circumstances. 400 of our staff was killed in Gaza. People do not see our effort in pushing for the reform of the international financial architecture. People do not see our efforts in pushing for climate action and climate justice, or our efforts in relation to gender equality. People see the Security Council. That's what appears in the headlines. And obviously, the Security Council is something created long ago and represents a world that no longer exists. There are no permanent representatives from Africa or from Latin America, and there are 3 European permanent representatives: the UK, France, and Russia. People might argue, but Russia is essentially a European country. It has also an Asian part, but its center is in Europe. I mean, this is totally at odds with the reality of today's world. And so, one thing I can guarantee is that in the action of the Secretariat of the UN, we will be doing everything to correct inequalities and injustices and to guarantee effective representation to developing countries. But we have not the power to reform the Security Council or to reform the IMF or the World Bank. All this depends on the will of member states. And usually those that have power are quite reluctant in accepting a redistribution of that power.
Thank you very much. My name is Israel Ifuribo, New Central Television in Nigeria. My question is simple. How do you think the world leaders who are gathered here this weekend, how do you think they should address the issue of debt relief for developing countries, especially in Africa? Because that's one of the big issues that African countries are facing today. Thank you, sir.
We have created an expert group on debt relief. They presented their recommendations. I just mentioned it in my intervention. I know that President Ramaphosa also has created a group on debt relief. And by the way, the chair of that group, Trevor Manuel, was also a member of our group. And what is interesting is the conclusions are very similar. It is clear that we have, first of all, to look into countries in distress and have an effective debt relief for those countries. And on the other hand, we must act in different ways, through the markets, dealing with credit rating agencies and taking initiatives in this regard, and through the intervention of the multilateral development banks, we need to reduce the cost of capital. And we need to make sure that there is equity in the criteria when countries borrow. There are European countries with a debt that is much higher than the debt of many African countries, but they still get access to the market with very low interest rates. And there are African countries that have solid finance and good development perspectives that still only have access to credit at very high rates. So we need to organize things in order to create the conditions, and there are ways to do it through guarantees, through the involvement of multilateral development banks, with private finance being them those that accept the first risk. There's a number of concrete measures that can be made in order to reduce the cost of capital, which would allow for lower indebtedness of countries. And at the same time, as I said, the mechanism that was put in place for debt relief has been acting too slow, and it needs a very meaningful reform for countries that indeed need a reduction of their debt to have a relatively rapid mechanism to be able to achieve that result. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General from the Democratic Republic of Congo. The first question is about climate issue. So do you think that COP30 in Belém was a success, or still a success, or a failure without some G20 members? I'm talking